Ever wonder how a single city became one of the most powerful empires the world has ever seen? Let's take a journey back in time to ancient Rome, a civilization that left its mark on history in ways we still feel today. When we think of Rome, we often picture mighty legions, grand coliseums, and emperors, and flowing togas. And while that's part of the story, it's so much more than that. Rome was a powerhouse of innovation, discipline, and sheer ambition. It all started as a small city-state on the Italian peninsula, but through conquest, strategy, and engineering, it grew into a sprawling empire that stretched from Britain to the Middle East. The Romans weren't just conquerors, they were master builders and organizers. Think about the roads they built, over 50,000 miles of paved highways connecting their vast territories. The famous saying, "All roads lead to Rome," wasn't just a figure of speech. It was reality. They allowed for the rapid movement of troops, trade, and information, effectively holding the massive empire together. But Rome's genius wasn't just in what they built, but how they thought. They gave us a legal system that has influenced laws around the world for centuries. Concepts like innocent until proven guilty and the importance of evidence have their roots in Roman jurisprudence. They created a republic, a government of the people, which, although very different from our modern democracies, laid the groundwork for the idea that citizens should have a say in how they are governed. This was a revolutionary concept that challenged the rule of absolute monarchs. And let's talk about their architecture. The Romans were masters of concrete and the arch, which allowed them to build structures on a scale never seen before. The Colosseum, an amphitheater that could hold over 50,000 spectators for gladiatorial games and public spectacles, is a testament to their engineering prowess. These weren't just functional structures, they were symbols of Roman power and ingenuity, designed to awe and inspire. Of course, life in Rome wasn't perfect for everyone. It was a society built on a strict hierarchy, with a huge gap between the wealthy elite and the common people, not to mention the millions of enslaved individuals who powered its economy. The empire's history is filled with political intrigue, brutal wars, and social unrest. Leaders like Julius Caesar, Augustus, and even controversial figures like Nero have become legendary. Their stories filled with ambition, betrayal, and power struggles that rival any modern drama. Despite its eventual decline and fall, Rome's legacy is undeniable. The Latin language evolved into modern Romance languages like French, Spanish, and Italian. Their literature, philosophy, and art have been studied and admired for millennia. From the calendar we use to the names of our planets, Roman influence is everywhere. They showed the world what was possible through organization, engineering, and law. So, the next time you walk on a paved road, visit a courthouse, or see a stadium, take a moment to remember the ancient Romans. They built more than an empire. They laid the foundations for the modern world. What part of Roman history fascinates you the most? Have you ever wondered what held the mighty Roman Empire together? It wasn't just legions and laws. It was something far more powerful. Something that touched every single aspect of Roman life. Religion. But this wasn't the kind of religion we might think of today, with a clear line between church and state. In ancient Rome, religion was asterisk. The state, it was the ultimate source of power. The invisible force that guided the destiny of the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. Imagine living in a world where the gods were not distant, abstract beings. They were active participants in your daily life. They controlled everything. Whether the legions won a glorious victory on the battlefield or suffered a crushing defeat, that was the will of the gods. Whether the harvest was bountiful, filling the granaries and feeding the people, or failed, bringing famine and despair, that too was the gods. Sickness, health, the birth of a child, the death of an emperor, every event, big or small, was a message from the divine. The future of Rome itself rested entirely in the hands of these powerful, often unpredictable, deities. Now, if the gods controlled everything, who speaks for them? This is where things get really interesting. Roman priests weren't just holy men who lived in quiet contemplation. They were some of the most influential figures in the empire. Think of them less as spiritual guides and more as high-ranking government officials. powerful politicians with a direct line to the divine. When a priest spoke, it was believed he was channeling the will of the gods. Their interpretations of omens, their declarations, could start wars, end them, appoint leaders, or condemn a man to death. Their words carried immense weight because challenging them wasn't just disagreeing with a person, it was defying the gods themselves. This system was built on a concept the Romans called pax deorum, which means the peace of the gods. The idea was simple. If Rome and its people correctly followed all the required religious rituals and honored the gods would, in turn, protect and favor the empire. It was a cosmic contract. Rome's prosperity, its military success, its very survival, depended on keeping the gods happy. And how did they do that? Through meticulous, unwavering adherence to tradition and ritual. The most famous were the pontiffs, led by the Pontifex Maximus, a title later adopted by the Pope. The pontiffs were the guardians of religious law. They managed the calendar, determining which days were auspicious for business or for battle. They oversaw all public and private ceremonies, ensuring every detail was correct. They were the ultimate legal experts on all things sacred. An emperor holding the position of Pontifex Maximus was a clear symbol of his total authority over both the earthly and divine realms. Then there were the augurs. These priests were masters of divination. Their job was to interpret the will of the gods by observing natural signs. The most common method was watching the flight of birds, where they flew, what kind of birds they were, the sounds they emitted, was all a complex code sent from the heavens. Before any major state action, whether it was a battle, an election, or the founding of a new temple, the augurs had to be consulted. If the omens were unfavorable, the event could be postponed or cancelled entirely. An augur's declaration of a bad omen could halt a political assembly in its tracks, giving them immense, and often politically useful, power. We also had the haruspices, who practiced an even more graphic form of divination. They would examine the entrails, particularly the liver, of sacrificed animals. The size, shape, and any marks on the liver were believed to reveal divine approval or disapproval. Imagine a general, about to lead his army into a decisive battle. The fate of thousands of men, and perhaps the empire itself, could hinge on whether a priest found a spot on a sheep's liver. These visceral, tangible connection to the divine will made their pronouncements incredibly powerful and difficult to argue with. This entire system, this fusion of religion and state, created a powerful tool for social and political control. If you wanted to delay a vote that was likely to go against you, you could arrange for a friendly augur to report unfavorable bird sightings. If you wanted to remove a political rival, you could accuse them of sacrilege, of offending the gods, a charge that was incredibly serious and could lead to exile or death. Religion wasn't just a backdrop to politics. It was the language of politics. It provided the ultimate justification for power. The emperor wasn't just a ruler. He was the chief priest, the intermediary between his people and the gods. His authority was divine. But what happened when Rome encountered other religions? As the empire expanded, it absorbed countless cultures with their own gods and traditions. Rome's approach was generally pragmatic. Instead of forcing everyone to abandon their beliefs, they often incorporated foreign gods into their own pantheon. They would identify a foreign god with a Roman equivalent, a process called interpretatio Romana, so the Greek Zeus became the Roman Jupiter. The Egyptian Isis was worshipped in Rome, and Celtic gods were given Latin names, as long as these new cults didn't challenge Roman authority or public order, and as long as their followers still respected the official state gods, they were generally tolerated. However, this tolerance had its limits. The problem arose with religions that were monotheistic and exclusive, those that demanded their followers worship only one god and deny the existence of the Roman gods. This was seen as a direct threat to the Pax Deorum. If a growing segment of the population refused to participate in the state rituals, they were, in Roman eyes, endangering the entire empire. They were breaking the sacred contract. This is the fundamental reason why early Christians faced such brutal persecution. It wasn't just that they had a different belief. It was that their refusal to sacrifice to the Roman gods and the emperor was seen as an act of treason, an act of cosmic rebellion that put everyone at risk. So, when we look back at the grand temples, the elaborate festivals, and the complex rituals of ancient Rome, we're not just seeing quaint superstitions. We are seeing the machinery of power. We're seeing a system where faith was inseparable from fear, where piety was a civic duty, and where the will of the gods was the ultimate political weapon. It was a world where priests were politicians, omens could stop armies, and the liver of a sheep could decide the fate of an empire. This intricate blend of religion and government was one of the key pillars that supported Rome for centuries, demonstrating that in the ancient world, controlling the heavens was the surest way to control the earth. Did you know that in ancient Rome, there was a group of women who were more revered, more respected, and more feared than even the empress? They held the fate of the entire Roman Empire in their hands. They were the Vestal Virgins, and their story is one of incredible power and unimaginable sacrifice. So, who were these mysterious women? The Vestal Virgins were the priestesses of Vesta, the Roman goddess of the hearth, home, and family. Their primary and most crucial duty was to tend the sacred flame in the Temple of Vesta, located right in the heart of the Roman Forum. This wasn't just any fire. The Romans believed that as long as this flame burned, Rome would be safe and prosperous. But if it were ever to go out, the city and the empire itself would fall into ruin. You can imagine the immense pressure these women were under, day and night. Because of this monumental responsibility, the Vestals were treated like rock stars of the ancient world. They had front row seats at public games, lived in a luxurious palace called the House of the Vestals, and were exempt from many of the laws that governed other women. They could own property, make wills, and even vote in some assemblies. When they traveled through the streets of Rome, they were carried in a litter, and everyone, even the highest-ranking magistrates, had to make way for them. They were, in many ways, the most powerful women in Rome. But how did one become a Vestal Virgin? The process began when they were just little girls, between the ages of 6 and 10. They were chosen by the Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief high priest. To be selected, a girl had to be from a respected patrician family and be physically perfect, with no blemishes or impairments. And, crucially, both of her parents had to be alive. Once chosen, she would leave her family behind and dedicate the next 30 years of her life to the service of Vesta. The 30-year term was divided into 3 decades. For the first 10 years, she was a novice, learning the sacred rituals and duties. For the next 10 years, she was a full-fledged priestess, responsible for tending the flame and performing ceremonies. And for the final 10 years, she would serve as a teacher, passing on her knowledge to the new novices. The purity of the Vestals was directly linked to the safety of Rome, and any perceived stain on their honor was a threat to the entire state. The Vestal Virgins were a paradox. They were simultaneously the most powerful and the most constrained women in the Roman world. They held immense religious and symbolic authority, but their personal freedom was almost non-existent. Their lives were a constant balance between immense privilege and the ever-present threat of a horrific death. They were the keepers of the flame, the guardians of Rome's destiny, forever bound to a sacred fire that represented both their power and their prison. What do you think? Was the power and prestige worth the sacrifice? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this glimpse into ancient Rome, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more stories from history. See you next time. Have you ever wondered why ancient societies were so obsessed with virginity? It might seem like it was all about morality, but the truth is much more complex and, frankly, a lot more political. It was about control. Let us dive into ancient Rome and look at one of the most powerful groups of women in the entire empire. The Vestal Virgins. These women weren't just religious figures. They were seen as the spiritual guardians of Rome itself. The Vestals were priestesses of Vesta, the goddess of the hearth, home, and family. From a young age, as young as 6, a select few girls were chosen for this incredible honor. For 30 years, they were sworn to celibacy. Their primary duty was to keep the sacred fire in the Temple of Vesta burning, a fire that was believed to be directly linked to the continuation and security of Rome. If that fire went out, it was considered a terrifying omen, a sign that the city's very existence was in jeopardy. Now, here's where virginity becomes a tool of state. The Romans believed that the physical purity of the Vestal Virgins was what guaranteed the safety and stability of their entire civilization. Their bodies weren't just their own. They became public symbols, living embodiments of Rome's well-being and its unbroken line of power. This wasn't a private matter. It was an issue of national security. The integrity of the Vestals was directly tied to the integrity of the state. So, what happened if a Vestal broke her vow of chastity? The consequences were dire, not just for her, but for everyone. The Romans believed that if a Vestal virgin lost her virginity, the gods would be enraged. This divine anger wasn't just a vague threat. It was seen as the direct cause of real-world catastrophes. If a military campaign failed, if an earthquake struck, if a plague swept through the city, who got the blame? Often, it was a Vestal accused of breaking her vow. This belief system created an immense amount of pressure. The body of a single young woman was essentially treated as a shield for the entire empire. Her personal life was sacrificed for the perceived public good. The punishment for a Vestal found guilty of unchastity was one of the most brutal imaginable. She would be taken to a place called the Campus Celeratus, the evil field, and buried alive, placed in an underground chamber with a small amount of food and water. She was left to die, a horrifying ritual designed to appease the furious gods. This shows us that the concept of virginity in ancient Rome was less about personal virtue and more about societal control and superstition. It was a way to explain the unexplainable, to find a scapegoat for disasters, and to reinforce the power structures of the state. The fate of an empire was placed on the shoulders of these women, turning their bodies into political instruments. It is a powerful and unsettling reminder of how deeply personal choices can be intertwined with public anxieties and the politics of. Have you ever heard of the Vestal Virgins? They were some of the most revered women in ancient Rome, but their story is much darker than you might think. Imagine being a little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, playing with your friends, living with your family. Then one day, everything changes. You're chosen, but this isn't a prize you wanted to win. This was the reality for the girls selected to become Vestal Virgins. They were handpicked, usually between the ages of 6 and 10, from prominent Roman families. Their consent wasn't asked for. Their families couldn't refuse. The moment they were chosen, their childhood was effectively over. They were taken from their homes, from their parents, and placed under the absolute authority of the Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest. Once inside the Temple of Vesta, their lives were no longer their own. They began a 30-year term of service. The first 10 years were spent as novices, learning the complex rituals and sacred duties they would perform. This was a grueling education. They had to memorize ancient rites, learn how to tend the sacred flame of Vesta, and understand the profound religious responsibilities placed upon their small shoulders. They were essentially child apprentices in one of Rome's most demanding religious roles. The next 10 years were spent performing these duties. Their most critical task was keeping the sacred fire of Vesta burning. Romans believed that if this flame ever went out, it would signal a terrible disaster for the city. The fate of Rome literally rested on their constant vigilance. They also guarded important state documents and sacred objects, making them living vaults of Rome's most precious secrets. During this time, they enjoyed incredible privileges that no other Roman woman had. They were legally independent, could own property, and write their own wills. In public, they had the right of way, and even the highest officials had to yield to them. Harming a Vestal was a capital crime. They sat in special seats at public games and ceremonies, symbols of the city's purity and divine favor. People revered them. But these privileges came at an immense cost. The most famous rule was the vow of chastity. For 30 years, they were forbidden from marrying or having any romantic relationships. The penalty for breaking this vow is terrifying: being buried alive. The Romans believed the blood of a Vestal was sacred and could not be shed, so this was their horrifying solution. Her alleged partner would be publicly flogged to death. The pressure to remain pure was unimaginable, and the consequences of a mere accusation were deadly. After their 30 years of service were complete, usually around the age of 40, a Vestal virgin was finally free. She was given a generous pension and was allowed to marry. But think about that. After a lifetime of seclusion and religious duty, how would you even begin to build a normal life? Many chose to remain within the temple compound, having known no other home. They had sacrificed their youth, their freedom, and their chance at a family for the sake of Rome. So while we see them as powerful and respected figures, it's crucial to remember the little girls who were forced into this life. They were children who had their families and their futures taken from them, all in the name of religion and the state. It's a stark reminder that behind the grand titles and sacred duties of history, there are often tragic human stories. What do you think? Was this a life of honor or a life of imprisonment? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Imagine living a life of luxury, respected by everyone in a powerful empire. You reside in a grand palace, wear the finest clothes, and hold a position so sacred that even the most powerful men bow to you. This was the life of a Vestal virgin in ancient Rome. Sounds pretty good, right? Well, the reality was far more complicated and dangerous than it appeared. This wasn't just a job. It was a 30-year sentence of constant pressure, scrutiny, and the ever-present threat of a horrifying death. The journey began when a young girl, between the ages of 6 and 10, was chosen for this high honor. She had to be from a noble family and physically perfect, without any blemishes. Once selected, she was taken from her family and brought to the house of the Vestals in the heart of the Roman Forum. Her hair was cut, she was dressed in white robes, and she began a new life dedicated to Vesta, the goddess of the hearth, home, and family. Her primary duty: to keep the sacred fire of Vesta burning, day and night, 365 days a year. This flame symbolized the eternal life and power of Rome itself. If it went out, it was considered a terrifying omen, a sign that the gods had abandoned the city. For the first 10 years, the new Vestal was a novice, learning the intricate rituals, prayers, and duties from the older priestesses. The next 10 years were spent performing these duties, maintaining the flame, and participating in numerous public ceremonies. The final 10 years were dedicated to teaching the next generation of novices. It was a life of structure and immense responsibility. They were guardians of sacred objects, keepers of last wills and testaments of powerful Romans, and their presence was required at major religious festivals and even at the gladiatorial games. In public, the Vestals were treated like rock stars. They had the best seats at public events. They could travel through the crowded streets of Rome in a special carriage, and anyone who injured them faced immediate execution. If a condemned prisoner on their way to execution happened to cross paths with a Vestal, they were automatically pardoned. Their legal status was unique too. Unlike other Roman women, they were independent of their father's control and could own property, vote in a limited capacity right, their own wills. From the outside, it was a life of privilege and power that no other woman in Rome could dream of. But this privilege came at an unimaginable cost. The single most important rule was the vow of chastity. For 30 years, from childhood until they were around 40, they were forbidden from having any romantic or physical relationships. This wasn't just a guideline, it was the law, enforced with brutal severity. The Romans believed that a Vestal's purity was directly linked to the safety and prosperity of the state. If a Vestal broke her vow, it was considered an act of treason and a grave pollution of the city, and the punishment was one of the most terrifying things you can imagine. A Vestal accused of breaking her vow was not executed in a conventional way. Because her body was sacred, it was forbidden to spill her blood, so the Romans devised a truly chilling alternative. She would be dressed in funeral clothes, paraded through the silent, mourning city, and then taken to an underground chamber. Inside, she was given a small amount of food, water, and a lamp. Then, the entrance was sealed, and she was left to die in the dark, buried alive. It was a slow, lonely, and agonizing end, meant to be a terrifying warning to all. So while the Vestals enjoyed unparalleled respect and luxury, they lived every single day under a microscope. Every conversation, every glance, every moment was scrutinized. A single rumor, a false accusation from a jealous rival, or one moment of weakness could lead to this horrific fate. After their 30 years of service were complete, they were free to leave, marry, and live a normal life. But by then, they were middle-aged women in a society that valued youth above all. Many chose to remain in the service of the goddess, the only life they had ever known. The golden cage of the Vestals was a testament to the complex and often brutal nature of power, religion, and the role of women in the Roman world. It was a life of honor, but one lived on the edge of a knife. Thanks for watching. If you found this glimpse into the life of a Vestal virgin fascinating, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories from the ancient world. See you next time.